Hello, I'm Ed Fuquay, young adult librarian extraordinaire here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
And I'm Michaela, human being here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library. I'm loving this new space.
Yes, this is the Studio Road here at the library.
Yeah, this is really cool.
It's this place designed for filming. I miss the wall of books behind us. But
I know, I miss our racks of books, but this will do, I suppose.
Yeah, this was set up for filming purposes here in the library.
Excellent.
So we're shifting from mystery over to science fiction for a while.
Yes, I'm so excited.
Yes, we both are big fans of science fiction, and we decided the first author we have to talk about because you have to start with him, and that's H.G. Wells.
H.G. Wells. They call him the Shakespeare of science fiction.
Yeah,
Yes.
he's called the father of science fiction also a lot of times because he invented the entire genre.
He really did. He was one of he paved the way. He paved the way for all of the wonderful science fiction, like books, movies, TV shows that we have today.
Oh yeah, the number of movies and other books spun off of his work is literally impossible to count.
I mean, science fiction, I think it's not off base to say it's the most exciting genre because anything can happen in science fiction. The rules are just so flux, and I love it. And he was a fascinating person who definitely wrote some of my favorite science fiction novels.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, let's talk about his life.
Yes, what a life that he had. I have 5 pages of notes here.
I know, I had to condense down. I did, over my research, I had so many pages, I was like, I don't want to do that to my poor printer.
Yeah.
So
he was the most celebrated, influential man in the world in his day.
Oh, absolutely. And he started from nothing. Like, he had absolutely
Extreme
nothing.
poverty, and he would go on to be that powerful and that wealthy. He was born in poverty. He referred to it by a stroke of luck. He broke his leg and spent like over a year in a cast.
When
he couldn't move.
When he was 8, and that's when he started devouring books.
He started reading every book he could get his hands on. He was incredibly creative.
Yes.
He wrote, of course. He also was an artist.
Yeah, he was an artist.
A painter.
Yeah, I saw some of his sketches. He was really, really good.
Did you know that at age 10 he wrote his first graphic novel?
I did not know that.
Yes.
That's excellent.
He wrote a book called The Desert Daisy. We just did it in pencil, so it was never printed or anything. But a copy of it still exists.
That's awesome.
I saw someone flipping through it in a documentary. Yeah, it's got a half-page illustration on each page with like text down below it.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it's a fantasy story. It's like,
Hey, it started then.
Yeah, pretty amazing stuff, Then his life took a bad turn when the family lost their business.
Yes.
His mother was forced to go to work as a servant. At 13, he left. He was taken out of school and was apprenticed to become a draper's apprentice.
Yeah, and after that apprenticeship also fell through, and he had to go find another apprentice.
His mother really loved drapers. I don't know why. She considered being a draper to be the single best job a young man could have. It was her dream for young Herbert, whom she called Bertie.
Yes.
It was her dream for young Bertie to one day be a draper, a respected gentleman who comes in and hangs curtains in your house.
How could he break his mother's heart and go on to be incredibly famous?
Yeah, I know. He went through 2 apprenticeships, and he finally walked out of one of them.
Yep.
He walked 30 miles to go back to his mother and said he was going to kill himself if she tried to send him back. And people think he was not bluffing.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is a person who is dreaming of life on other planets. I can assume that the day-to-day of just going and hanging curtains would feel a bit, you know.
As an apprentice, he worked from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m.
Yeah.
He said once, and we talked about that time, no writing, no painting, no drawing. You know, it was like the most creatively infertile period of his life.
Yeah. Just stitching, just hemming.
That's all he did. Learning useful skills, but it didn't stick with him. He could not stick to that kind of schedule. So he went back to where his mother was. Now, this is fortunate because his mother was now a servant in a very big house, and he lived downstairs in the servants' quarters. But the house had a fabulous library, which he was allowed to go through.
That's awesome.
Yeah, there were 2 things about this part of his life that shaped the rest of his future. First of all, he saw how the other half lived, and he really wanted it.
Yeah, I mean, you see the upstairs, you're going to want to be in the upstairs.
Being a servant in the big house, he saw how the rich people lived and thought that was the life for him.
I mean, it's essentially like he went to the house in Downton Abbey and he was just like, I desperately want to be with the upstairs people, mother.
Yeah, he read everything he could get his hands on. He read omnivorously, histories. He read... Ovid and Plato and,
Well, the things he wound up publishing, too, he was not just a science fiction author, and I know we'll get into that, but textbooks. I mean...
He was a hugely prolific writer. Yes, he wrote textbooks that were used in schools.
We would call him a nerd today. A nerd we'd want to be friends with, but a nerd nonetheless.
Oh, yeah. He had it all. Finally... either his mother gave up on her dream of him being a draper or he found his own way out because with the erudition he gained at the library, the largely self-taught wisdom, he was able to become a teacher's assistant.
Yes.
And during that period, he was both teaching and a student at the same time.
Yep. At the normal
school of science. Yeah.
Which now, of course, today is, I forget exactly which very famous English college it is, but when I read that, he was at the Normal School of Science. What a flashy, poppy name.
I should have looked it up. I don't know why normal school was so popular, but that was a type of school in those days. So he both taught there and went on to be a student, and he took every test that he could take to qualify for various things. For 2 years, he basically squeezed an entire lifetime worth of education.
Yeah.
And during that time, he aced every test that he took.
Yep.
He came out at top marks in chemistry, physics, astronomy, and several other unrelated topics. Yeah.
He knew what he was talking about.
Oh, yeah. There was very little that he wasn't an expert on. And he eventually got a scholarship to go to university.
Yep.
And from then on, nothing could stop him.
Yeah, no, the world was at his feet. Well, except for the brief period of time, where he was left without a source of income and he had to go live with his aunt, basically, so he'd have a roof over his head. He wasn't homeless.
True. He wasn't making any money yet. Money is the ultimate...
Yeah, that is the goal, to get the big house and live in the upstairs portion of the said big house.
At university, he had the privilege of having as a professor Thomas Huxley.
Yeah.
The genius biologist who was referred to as Darwin's bulldog. He was basically the one who took Darwin's evolutionary theories and explained it to ordinary people who didn't want to take the time and energy to read Darwin.
Yeah.
So he was the great explainer of Darwin's theory. A huge fan of evolution, natural selection, and he and H.G. Wells were best buddies.
I could imagine that, yes.
Yeah, their teacher-pupil relationship was intense. You will see theories of evolutionary biology crop up in so much of Wells's later work. It all comes from Huxley.
That's awesome.
Yeah, just reading Darwin, Origin of the Species had a profound impact on Wells. And his science fiction, yeah.
Well, it gives you, a deeper understanding of natural life on this planet. And for somebody who is, once again, talking about life on other planets, not all of his novels, but it does kind of spark, okay, how would this happen in this environment over here on this planet with the little that we know about this planet?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The extrapolation of what life could be like out there. I mean, other people had thought about it, but they didn't have both Wells's vivid imagination and his scientific background at the same time.
It's a beautiful meshing of both art and science. It's beautiful to read his novels and actually know that there was, at the time at least, the founding in, this is popular science at the time. I'm just tweaking it a bit for my narrative purposes.
Well, his first job that paid real money was a journalist, and he was what we today call a science reporter.
Yeah.
He would report on various scientific things, and he had a knack of explaining them to ordinary people that made him a very popular journalist. He made enough money to support his parents with his journalism. He still wasn't rich, but he was now successful.
Listen, as a writer, to be able to support your family, that's amazing.
Yeah. He also fell in love with his cousin Isabel.
Yeah, while he was staying at his aunt's house.
While he was staying at his aunt's house, he fell in love with his cousin.
And shocker, that did not turn out well.
It did not turn out well at all. For one thing, for whatever reason, Wells had grown up really detesting Victorian morality.
Yeah.
It didn't come from his parents. Exactly where he got this streak of rebellion against all things, puritanical, we don't know.
Yeah.
But he married Isabel and discovered to his horror that she considered sex to be horrifically awful, a hideous thing women had to put up with after they get married. She was repulsed by the idea of having sex with him. And
He was, he was a bit
that
of a,
hurt, yeah.
Yeah, not only that, he was clearly a man of appetites, not just for knowledge, but he was a man of appetites for life and all the things he could learn, and also specifically sex. I mean, we're going to talk about his later life, but he had, when I was reading, several articles just called it a significant number of women. There's not an exact
the list of them is astounding.
Number, but he wound up leaving his wife Isabel because he fell in love with one of his students. Ran off with her, and then of course had scores and scores of affairs.
He wouldn't get married. He was still married to Isabel for a long time. And he wouldn't get married to his current lovers. And whenever they would move in together, if the landlord found out they weren't married, they would throw them out, of course. So he did everything he could in his whole life to shatter Victorian morality. In 1893, he finished a biology textbook that very quickly went into print and was used in schools. And that earned him a tidy sum, enough to relax his journalism career for a while. And he was settled down with one of his lovers. He was with Amy Robbins at that point. He was with Amy. And that made him comfortable enough to actually worry about doing something with all the ideas in his head he didn't really know what to do with, the fantasies he'd had in his head since he was a little kid. And he had written a short story he jotted off when he was still in college called The Chronic Argonauts, which is a terrible title for a story.
It sounds like a medical disease where you have a stomach issue.
It sounds like a condition.
I've got the chronic Argonauts, I'm sorry.
But he thought, but it involved people who travel through time, and he thought that was kind of a really good idea. He thought, I could do something with that. So he tossed out most of the ideas from Chronic Argonauts and rewrote it. And he rewrote it and rewrote it. Over the course of 7 years, he wrote 6 complete drafts of this book that he eventually decided to call The Time Machine.
And he is the one who coined the phrase time machine.
He invented the word time machine.
Any sort of, a machine that allows you to go to a selective point in history, it is considered an H.G. Wells machine. Like, it is based off of that time machine from H.G. Wells' The Time Machine.
And Time Machine, although the idea of traveling through time had certainly been around, it was always in fantasies rather than anything that had a scientific bearing to it. Even though he didn't explain how this time machine worked ever. But he talked about it in completely scientific terms. It was done by an inventor, not a magician. I mean, there's certain similarities between Time Machine and Christmas Carol by Dickens. Because Scrooge also gets to see his past and his probable future and things like that.
But instead of ghosts and magic and...
It involves science. And plus, as a scientist, when H.G. Wells looked at the human race, he saw something that a lot of people didn't. He realized that by Darwin's theories, evolution is constantly happening. It's happening all around us. And Time Machine had a lot of messages for people. We'll talk about that in depth soon. But one thing that it did was it shocked Victorians with the idea that at some point in the future, there may not be a British Empire for some reason. The idea that the British Empire could, the whole idea the British Empire could just vanish.
One of the Queen's men is going to burst through that door for you saying that, right?
I know. There's no reason why the halls of Parliament can't be found someday like some ancient temple in the jungle or something.
It'll crumble like the Roman Empire. Every great civilization one day will fall.
And that was the issues that he tried to address. He once said that, this is my one shot, he said, when he wrote Time Machine. And it took off immediately. It was a huge bestseller. It's never been out of print. He coined a new term for it. It's a scientific romance. Which was before science fiction hadn't been invented yet. So the idea of a scientific romance became the name of this genre that he invented, pioneered and everything. But this time he and Amy were collaborators. He mostly wrote things himself, but she was always his beta reader. She was always there to do a first draft of everything.
She was his editor.
Exactly. She contributed a lot. And mostly she made him feel happy and contented for at least a while, and it gave him the impetus to write. He was worried about the human race. He wanted to create a utopia, which unfortunately led him down bad things like eugenics and so forth, which he never really embraced wholeheartedly, but, he wrote all kinds of stuff. He was highly prolific. We can't even list all the things that he wrote here. He had a story called Kip, which is very autobiographical. In its day, it was his best-selling book.
Oh, really?
Yeah, today it's almost unknown.
I would think like Invisible Man, War of the Worlds, but Kip?
At the time, that was his best book.
Okay.
He was compared favorably to Dickens. He was the next Dickens, critics said.
The modern Dickens
is
here.
Exactly, yeah. He also was interested again in like making dings in Victorian society. He wrote books called things like Passionate Friends and Anne Veronica, which are both about women pursuing their own sexuality. And mind you, there's no sex in the book at all. He was still a Victorian gentleman. But about women who refused to follow society's norms was the themes of the book. And that made him a real champion to feminists, the whole women's suffrage movement. He became a very popular champion of women's rights, which did not diminish his chances with the ladies one little bit.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So many affairs. I want to just touch briefly on his atheism, which in that period, I mean, he was raised, of course, by a religious family. I mean, everybody was very religious in Victorian England. God was part of the daily, the day-to-day. And even in his writing, it cited multiple times, like he did not oppose using the word God as long as it had nothing to do with anything related to humankind.
Exactly. He thought if there was a God, it was so cold and impersonal and distant that it's pointless. Why even think about it?
Theology, much like all of the other subjects he studied every option and just came to the conclusion.
That was his logical deduction.
Atheism is what makes
sense. In War
of
the Worlds, where the unnamed narrator is staggering through a street full of burning houses, he runs into someone else who cries out, how could God let this happen? And the protagonist says, what use is religion if it fails you when you need it the most?
Yeah, but you can see those themes throughout his writing, which for somebody alive at this time, it's just absolutely, very progressive for the time and amazing that, he was as popular as he was, because if you think about it, where God is such a, day-to-day part of the lives of these people, to be embraced, I see it as a wonderful thing, because it is a different idealism. It's a different way of seeing the world, and he was embraced for it mostly.
He never really came out with his atheism all that strong, like he did some of his other beliefs. But there's no question there's a strong atheistic theme through all of his books. He doesn't have to say it. It's obvious by the way he writes that he's writing about protagonists in a universe where they already know there is no God to help them.
Well, especially a lot of his writings are based in science, and science and God do tend to mix like oil and water. Yeah. So, so you do see that in his writing, and especially for writing of this time period, it's almost refreshing. Yeah. Just to kind of have that break. And once again, it's breaking down that Victorian morality.
Oh, yeah. He was an atheist. He was a socialist. He was a believer in open marriages and free love. A lot of things that could have made him unpopular, but he was, in fact, wildly popular. He was a huge celebrity.
Yeah, he was. But yeah, we can talk about some of his affairs. I mean, the significant number of women. I know he did wind up eventually having a child with one of his lovers, which of course, he's got a line now. Yeah. Mostly because I just want to touch on the fact that his grandson was tagged to be one of the consultants for Back to the Future.
Well, his grandfather wrote Time Machine, so obviously who else would you call him?
Through genetics, clearly he's going to understand. Yeah. Well, that's why, I mean, the crisp, clean science of Back to the Future.
Clearly, at least they had an expert working on it. He had an affair with Margaret Sanger, the birth control activist. He fell in love with a 19-year-old girl named Amber, who was the daughter of a prominent socialist. And he had a child with her.
Yes.
Out of wedlock, of course, but they didn't bother him in those ways. Amy, his wife, they worked out some kind of a bargain. And no one really knows exactly what it was, whether she resented his running around or whether she just put up with it because she felt she had to. She was busy raising their children and running the household. And at some point, they struck some sort of a bargain where he was allowed to go out and pursue other women, but he had to be honest about it. He couldn't do it behind her back.
Yeah, they had for that time, what we would today call an open polyamorous relationship.
Well, Amy got along well with Amber. Yeah. When Amber was pregnant, Amy was there to give her advice, having had, I think, two kids at that point.
Their children are going to be siblings, might as well.
Exactly. So they got along very well with each other.
I do know there was one writer, and I'm looking for the name in my notes, that he did have an affair with. She was 27 years his senior. Yeah, there's Amy. Yeah, there is Amy. Yep. Dutch adventurer and writer Odette Kuhn, with whom he lived in Le Pidoux, a house they built together in France. He dedicated one of his longest books to her, and of course, there's a watermark on the name of the book. And then when visiting Maxim Gorky in Russia in 1920, he had slept with Gorky's mistress, the then still Countess Beckendorf, the 27 years his junior. Yes. I feel like just every woman he met walking down the street. He was a huge ladies' man.
He was amazingly successful. Women would write him begging to become one of his lovers.
Yeah.
He had a woman would show up wearing nothing but like shoes and a long coat one time at his house. When he was in his 50s, mind you.
Yeah. And then like later in life, I know he came down with diabetes. They don't know if that was the only thing that was contributing to his deteriorating health, but he wanted to actually establish a diabetic ward in the local hospital.
He worked a lot with the Diabetes Association.
Yes, he did. He tried to raise money for that in his life. I think he just fell short of it before he did eventually pass away. But he lived a long life. He lived to be 79.
He lived to see the end of World War II, which for someone who was a pacifist meant the last years of his life were very, very sad.
He passed in 46, which at least he got to, see the end of that horrible war, especially like primarily living in England at that time.
But he also got to see the atomic bomb being dropped, and he had predicted the atomic bomb. He actually described it 20 years earlier, how it would work. It was almost exactly the way he described it, it turned out.
Yeah, some of his writing, especially at the time it was published, it feels almost like an oracle giving out the predictions of the future. I mean...
His prescience was amazing. He had written a book about a weapon known as an ironclad, which was essentially a tank.
Yeah.
He invented the whole idea of a tank that ran on treads before they had ever been built. He wrote a book called War in the Air, hypothesizing how if planes were a little better than they are now, we'd be able to fight entire wars without touching the ground. And within a few years, World War I broke out with many of the major conflicts happening in the air. And World War II was an air war in so many ways.
Yeah, it's like he had this gift of clairvoyance and to see his worst nightmares come to life, essentially.
Well, he wanted, world peace. He wanted, a one world government at one point he was agitating for. But his bitterness after the First World War convinced him that nations are only interested in their own self-interest, that they will never work together to create a better world. He felt basically that people had to do it because governments wouldn't. Mm-hmm. The League of Nations was a great idea, but they were absolutely powerless and fell apart almost immediately. And again, he saw that coming in his books and things to come. He predicted it.
Well, the only thing that would make us band together as, citizens of Earth would be, a threat from the stars.
Exactly.
Which is threatening all of us. That's the great unifier. There has to be something larger than us to bring us together. That's it. What's
interesting is also the plot of Alan Moore's Watchmen.
Yeah.
So, yes, Wells was ahead of his time in so many ways. He wrote an outline of history. He wanted people to see the way he looked at the world, like why he was so pessimistic. And so he did an outline of history, literally an history of the entire Earth, beginning as far back as they had records of in those days. Every important thing that happened in world history. And no one had ever tried to write a comprehensive history book before that covered everything. And it was a huge bestseller.
Oh, yeah, I mean...
Yeah, it's literally an encyclopedia, and it sold like hotcakes. It was amazing.
It's the encyclopedia of man. That's what it is. That's amazing.
Yeah, it was 1,000 pages long altogether. He printed it in 24 installments as he was writing it. Yeah.
It's amazing. And it was a bestseller.
It was considered the second best-selling book of the 20th century, actually.
That's fabulous.
Yeah, after the Bible.
It's always after the Bible. Yeah. It's always after the Bible. We're never going to beat Bible.
But in his later life, he had massive depression. His health declined due to diabetes. Amy died. Yeah. And despite all the other lovers he had, he never stopped being in love with her. He lived long enough to see his books burned by Hitler.
I mean, like, if Hitler hated them, you're doing something right.
Yeah. One of the books that Hitler had burned was Things to Come, in which he predicts that Germany invading Czechoslovakia will trigger a world war. Yeah. Okay. When Orson Welles interviewed him, Wells makes the comment, "We're living in Wells's future." And I mentioned Orson Welles, who's no relation, because...
Yes. Well, next week we are going to talk about War of the Worlds, the novel, and the famous radio broadcast. And I am obsessed with this radio broadcast. It is just... and the panic that ensued.
Yes, if anyone hadn't was familiar with Wells before then, it definitely his name was on everyone's lips afterwards. It boosted the career tremendously of both Orson Welles and H.G. Wells, who was not as popular in America as he was in England at the time. During World War II, he stayed in London during the Blitz, even though he had several houses he could have moved to. He was part of a volunteer fire brigade. He was pushing 60, I think, at this point.
Listen, he wanted a utopia, and he did what one man could do to make the world a better place.
One of his quotes that really struck home with me was he was worried about literally mankind's future. He saw the extinction of mankind. And at one point he said, the odds are against man, but it is still worth fighting for.
H.G. Wells. He was just so good.
In his later life, when he was trying to educate people on the kind of world we should be living in, he wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which eventually inspired the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Man. It was based on Wells's work. He never lived to see the United Nations do their best to fulfill that, but the Human Rights Declaration, that comes from Wells.
Listen, his impact was absolutely massive. I am so happy we get to sit down and talk about him and his works. He is just, if anyone who's out there listening, if you have not read the works of this wonderful man.
And unlike a lot of writers, first of all, though he wrote nearly 100 years ago, his work is still very accessible. He wrote short stories.
Yes.
I mean, even his novels, you can read them pretty quickly, which is why they're assigned often to elementary school students for school projects. Anybody can sit down and read War of the Worlds or Time Machine.
You'll get different things out of it, of course, if you read them at different periods of your life. Like War of the Worlds is when you read it in elementary school, you read it in high school, you read it in college, and you get something different out of it every time because, while it is a really cool book about, the Martians coming down, it is at its core a book about human nature, and it's
some of the influence of Wells, you can't measure it. One thing that amused me was he coined the phrase New World Order. And he was not referring to a secret Illuminati bankers who manipulated governments. He was referring to everybody around the world coming together. He imagined a benign socialist government run entirely by scientists.
Put the smartest people in charge.
Yes. Every other famous person at the time either loved him or hated him. George Orwell did not like him, thought that he was a muddle-headed dreamer. But even Orwell was willing to admit any thinking person born around the beginning of the century is more or less Wells's child.
That's excellent.
He also helped create tabletop role-playing games.
This I did not know.
Yes. He wrote 2 books, one called Floor Games and one called Little Wars. Now, there had always been people who collected military miniatures.
Yeah, you've got all the little tin soldiers. And
he invented a way you can actually have combat war games with the miniature soldiers. And since all the miniature soldiers are based on actual armies, he hypothesized you could make up fictional fantasy armies and pit them against each other. He actually wrote rules for doing this.
So he basically came up with Risk and...
with Risk and more or less D&D, things like that. So that's... those books are highly influential.
As if I couldn't love him more.
One of the reasons why I love him so much, you know how much I love spin-offs and everything.
Yes.
Now, because he invented time travel, virtually every fictional character who travels through time has to meet him. Also, because several of his books, like War of the Worlds and Time Machine, have unnamed narrators. We don't know who is telling the story. So people just assume it's Wells himself. So Wells becomes a swashbuckling adventurer in several, not just once or twice, but in several different things. In Time After Time, he fights Jack the Ripper. There's a TV series called Infinite Worlds of H.G. Wells, in which Wells, as a young man, investigates various things while he's a reporter, which all are fodder for things he will later write about in his short stories. And that had a spin-off series called Nightmare Worlds of H.G. Wells, which goes into his fantasy and horror stories, because he wrote those too. And it's narrated by an actor playing H.G. Wells, sort of Rod Serling style, introducing the stories. H.G. Wells has teamed up with the Doctor from Doctor Who.
Of course. I mean, you can't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He appeared on the Lois and Clark, the Superman series. He was on Legends of Tomorrow. I said any time traveling series. He makes it on the cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
He is. Yes, he is on the cover. Yes, that one I did know.
Now, one of the weirdest and in some ways the worst interpretation of his real persona, though, is a series called Warehouse 13. Heroes discover that H.G. Wells is actually a woman, Herbert's fictional sister, who was the real writer, and Herbert was just taking credit for everything that she actually wrote. It's really kind of a horrible attempt to do a feminist twist on it. Wells was so famous and so popular in his day that somebody else actually wrote his stuff is ludicrous. That is all kept secret for over 100 years.
Oh, it's very hush-hush. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It made very little sense. It was not a good series of episodes. H.G. Wells, man, what an amazing person.
He had a roller coaster of a life. He came up with just a beautiful mixture of science and art come together in this beautiful imagination that produced some of the just coolest books.
His logical and sensible way of looking at things because of his scientific background makes him describe almost anything in a way that makes it seem realistic, even the things that are patently absurd. Island of Dr. Moreau makes no sense whatsoever.
Oh, God, but
and yet
how iconic.
You believe everything that happens in that.
I mean, we reference Moreau all the time, and I'm so excited to get to dive into this.
Oh, yeah. It's going to be a great ride. There's so much to talk about here.
It's going to be fun summer of science fiction. I'm so excited.
I can't wait.
Awesome.
All right. Any closing comments?
Just H.G. Wells. Yeah. I love you. I didn't know you helped create tabletop role-playing games, but I love you even more for it.
Yeah. I'm not sure if anyone could have that big an impact on their world today as he had on his world.
Yeah, and I mean, he was just one man, and he was one man doing what he could. And, that's awesome.
Yeah. All right, well, until next time, I have been Ed.
I have been Michaela.
We'll see you then. Until then, be safe.
Be happy, be healthy. Bye.
Bye.